Okay, welcome back, everybody. So this should be the second of the two videos that you should be watching in our first day on Unit 3, Absolutism and Constitutionalism. So in part 1, we looked at what absolutism is, what defines an absolute monarch, some of the challenges to absolute monarchies, and then some of the philosophy that we see behind absolutism. Now we're going to start to get into the different states throughout Europe that tried to establish absolutism. And this is going to be much of the next several days of this unit. And we are going to start with some of the earliest absolutist states. So we're going to look at the foundations of European absolutism. And we're going to start with Spain. And as you can tell by the title of this slide, Spain is not doing great at this point. But they are going to be very foundational for the later development of absolutist monarchies in Europe. So let's look at the decline of Spain. We've talked about how about Spain as this major power, and we've talked about how it's kind of on its way out for a good couple units now. And we're finally going to see that end up really at its end point. So in the 16th century, Spain really had all the standard features of an absolute monarchy. It had a permanent bureaucracy, giant standing army, national taxes, religious orthodoxy, big fancy palace, and its kings even claimed divine right. A lot of that we saw get established with Ferdinand and Isabella. And it appeared to be one of the most powerful states in Europe, certainly had the most expensive empire in Europe. But ultimately, that power was really unstable. And we're going to see a few reasons that power is not going to last. So let's look at the three main reasons for Spanish decline. There's economic reasons, social reasons, and political reasons. Let's start with economic reasons for Spain's decline. Well, a lot of this we actually talked about already. So the age of exploration led to a lot of gold and silver from the Americas coming into the Spanish economy. That accelerated inflation by increasing the money supply. And we're also going to see those mercantilist policies kind of come back to bite Spain in the butt. Because if you are basing your economic system on government-sanctioned monopolies, all of the wealth coming from trade and exports is going to go to those government-sanctioned monopolies and nobody else. Which meant that when you have too many of these government-sanctioned monopolies, because you are basing your entire economy off of it, wealth is only going to a few groups and nobody else, and so nobody else has money to spend, and so the economy is going to stagnate. This is a major downside of mercantilism as opposed to the capitalism that we see developing in the Netherlands, for example. We're also going to see the flow of bullion start to decline as the mines in the New World start to empty. We also start to see a lot more pirate attacks sanctioned by monarchs like Elizabeth or the Netherlands, or just very smart opportunity-seeking pirates who see these gigantic ships full of gold and silver traveling across the Atlantic by themselves. They were sitting ducks for any pirate who could catch up to them. But that's not going to be the only thing that puts a huge drain on the Spanish economy. We also see massive military expenditures. In fact, the Spanish military expenditure, how much they were spending on their military, was 5 times that of the Dutch, English, and French combined. That is ridiculous. They had way too many wars. And because of that, we're going to start to see an overall decline of the Spanish army, which had at one point been the most powerful army in Europe. We start to see a lot of desertions and mutinies because once you can't afford to pay soldiers and you stop paying soldiers, they do not want to fight for you anymore. And so we're going to see the Spanish army just start to fall apart due to non-payment. Spain also just couldn't bear the financial burden of their war against the Dutch and the French during the 30 Years' War. And this is where we see the Spanish forced to recognize Dutch independence in the Peace of Westphalia. Remember, the Spanish and the Holy Roman Empire were still very much linked under the Habsburgs. So a lot of these military, endeavors are things that we saw under Charles V, for example, and the loss of the Netherlands to the Holy Roman Empire is, the same deal as a loss to Spain. But in the Peace of Westphalia, if you'll remember, one of the big things is that the Netherlands got their independence finally. And generally, we see the Spanish economy just become stagnant. They aren't having enough income from their overseas colonies. They've lost tax bases in all this territory they lost in the Netherlands. And eventually, we see the economy just start to collapse. If you'll remember when we talked about Philip II, the big rival of Queen Elizabeth, he had to declare bankruptcy in the late 1500s. And this kind of thing is going to continue to Philip III in the early 1600s. And Philip was known for his economic mismanagement and focus on luxury. And you're spending all this money on luxury and nothing else, that does not a healthy economy make. And under Philip III, the weakness of Spain became really, really apparent. Let's look at some social reasons for Spanish decline. We actually see a major population decline in Spain over the course of the 16th century, a lot of it due to plague. And with fewer people, we see fewer people to pay taxes, and so we see a decline in tax revenue for the government. And if you'll remember, that's really, really important for funding things like armies. We also see agricultural crises and harvest failures as well. We see a very weak commercial class in Spain because they have a lot less freedom under those mercantilist policies. They can't be buying and selling and making money for themselves. It all goes to the government, and so they can't acquire as much wealth to do all of their contributions to the economy. We also see that with that burden on taxes, taxes have to, come from somewhere. And so we start to see the government putting even greater taxes on Spanish citizens. And so we start to see the peasantry especially getting really, really resentful of how much they're being taxed as well as suppressed. And they're going to start to become really resentful towards the nobility who are collecting these taxes, and we're going to start to see a series of peasant revolts as a result of this. And of course, those nobles who were benefiting from those mercantilist policies and from being nobility are really, really into luxury. And that luxury-loving class of nobility is not going to be popular with the overly taxed, very poor, very downtrodden lower classes of society. And we're also going to see the expulsion of religious minorities in Spain, going all the way back to the Inquisition, start to really come back to haunt Spain, as if you need another reason not to persecute religious minorities. Because if you'll remember, the Jews, for example, had been a major part of the Spanish economy before the Inquisition. And when, Jews had to flee Spain, we see a lot of that damage the manufacturing and commercial sectors of the economy that they had been working in. And so after the Jews leave, we see a much weaker manufacturing and commercial sector in Spain. And so that's less revenue. And, because of that social decision to persecute religious minorities. Finally, let's look at the political reasons for Spanish decline. So Philip II, part of his strategy in controlling the government was to give the nobility of Castile, if you remember, that's actually where Isabella was from, which is a region in Spain. He gave the nobility of Castile a huge amount of control over the government and economic bureaucracy of Spain. That was great for them and great for him because he didn't have to deal with it and he could trust them. But that caused a huge amount of resentment across all of the other regions of Spain because they didn't like that the Castilian nobility were the ones in charge. We also start to see a lot of resistance to that taxation from all across the Spanish Empire. Their holdings in the Netherlands were very against all these taxes. We saw the end result of that. They also had Italian subjects. Spain still controlled Sicily, for example. And they are going to be very against all these taxes. And other Spanish kingdoms are going to be very against these taxes. And we're going to start to see a series of revolts in the 1640s from places like Catalonia, Portugal, Naples, and Sicily, all places that the Spanish held. And we actually talked about this briefly because we saw that in 1668, Portugal was able to achieve its independence from Spain because of these revolts. However, Portugal was actually the only state who managed to do that as a result of these revolts. And that's because in the other Spanish states, these revolts led to peasant uprisings against all nobility, who they very rightly blamed for all their problems. And unfortunately, the leaders of those rebellions against the Spanish monarchy were nobles, which meant that when the peasants rose up, they didn't care whether they were fighting against the local nobles or the Spanish kings, and the rebellious nobility were forced to side with the Spanish monarchy in order to fight off these peasant rebellions. Great demonstration of inequality leading to political instability. And so those revolts didn't lead to independence in the way we saw in Portugal, but that didn't mean that the Spanish monarchy was able to gain any power or even maintain the power that it had previously. And really, we start to see the Spanish Empire becoming spread way too thin. And we start to see them have to withdraw from some of their most ambitious international endeavors, including in the Americas. Poverty and low population in the American colonies meant that they couldn't support the colonial economy, the colonial market, and all those mercantilist policies that relied on the colonies to extract resources and send them back to the mother country. Well, if there's not a whole lot of resources and not a whole lot of people to farm those resources, maybe because you killed all of them, then the economy in those colonies isn't going to do great, and so that's less money coming in to the mother country. And we're going to see by the reign of Philip IV that Spain manages to regain a degree of stability after those revolts, but it's going to become really a second-level state compared to other growing powers in Europe. And it's going to have a weakened king who is going to have to allow the nobility to run the government and the economy because the king just did not have the power to do so anymore. And really, this is going to be the end of the new monarchy and absolutism and attempts at control by the king that we saw established all the way back with our friends Ferdinand and Isabella. This is the end of what Ferdinand and Isabella started, and it ends in financial ruin and finally some stability, but at the cost of all of this ambition and power. And we're going to see a lot of this embodied in Charles II, also called Carlos II in Spanish. And this is where we also see the end result of our friends, the Habsburgs. Now, Charles II was referred to as El Hechizado, apologies for the pronunciation, which means the bewitched. And that is because of his physical, intellectual, and emotional disabilities and infertility as a result of the Habsburg incestual dynamics. And if we look at this this chart here, this family tree, we can get a sense of why that might be, right? Charles is all the way down at the bottom there. His parents were uncle and niece, and you can see that, his uncle was, from a long line of incestual relationships, and his niece was also from a long line of incestual relationships. And as we've talked about with the Habsburgs, this does not lead to good health. And you can see by this portrait here, kind of the end result of that Habsburg jaw. And he became king at the age of 3. Charles II did. Became the king at the age of 3, but he did not learn to speak until the age of 4, and could not walk until the age of 8. Because of his extremely oversized Habsburg jaw, he could barely speak or chew. He didn't go to school. He was also not required to bathe or be clean. And he ended up dying due to all of these medical conditions at the age of 39. A historian is quoted as having said, "Of no man is it more true to say that his beginning was his end. From the day of his birth, they were waiting for his death." So finally, we see the end result of all of those Habsburg shenanigans that we have seen in the last couple units. Poor guy. So take a minute, pause the video if you need, and respond to this question. What factors contributed to the decline of Spain as a major power in the 17th century? Pause the video if you need, and then we will move on. Okay, so let's move on from Spain and look at what's really going to be our prime example of a successful absolute monarchy in this unit. We're going to be focusing a lot on France for the next few days. And that is because France is going to be the foundational and exemplary absolute monarchy in this era. But before we get to the culmination of that with Louis XIV, let's talk about the foundations of absolutism in France. A lot of this started with the success of Henry IV, good old Henry of Navarre. He lowered taxes on peasants, which made him very popular. He had, showed a great deal of religious toleration in order to end the religious conflicts. This is where we see the Edict of Nantes. He also improved French commerce and infrastructure, which is great for the economy. And really, Henry IV is considered the king who really laid the foundations for the growth of state power in France. But, like we mentioned, Henry IV was assassinated eventually. And his son, Louis XIII, was still a child when he was murdered, which meant that Marie de Medici became his regent while Louis XIII was growing up. And Marie de Medici appointed Cardinal Richelieu, our good old friend Cardinal Ritchie, as chief minister, essentially as the another kind of regent of the government while Louis was still a child. And we already talked about Cardinal Richelieu a bit, and I said that we were going to talk more about him because he is not only very important to French involvement in the 30 Years' War, but he is also very important to what's going on in France back home. He created policies that strengthened monarchical power even further. And under Richelieu, we see a growth of the French bureaucracy and increased revenue for the French state. He also developed a network of spies to uncover plots by unruly nobles. And this guy, like we've said before, is a classic example of a politique. He's quoted as having said, "Where the interests of the state are concerned, God absolves actions which, if privately committed, would be a crime." It's basically very Machiavellian, right? The ends justify the means. And one of Richelieu's most influential policies is setting up the generalities and intendants. The generalities were administrative units that Richelieu divided France into. And these were then monitored by government officials, known as intendants, who reported directly to the king. It was their job to enforce royal orders, and to collect taxes efficiently for the monarchy, and in doing so, this undermined the influence of the regional nobility because they had been the ones in charge of collecting taxes in the past, and they could skim a bit off the top anytime they did. And because the intendants were dependent entirely on royal favor for their position, they vigorously supported the king, right? They were directly loyal to the king and made sure that all that tax revenue was going to the king like it was supposed to. And this is going to allow for that growth of the centralized bureaucracy of the French kings. And Richelieu also, being a cardinal, was very Catholic. And in his view, France could not rely on religious plurality. He argued in favor of one people, one faith. And he is going to start to strip the Huguenots of their military and political independence that we saw granted to them by the Edict of Nantes. If you remember back to one of the documents in our 30 Years' War DBQ, for example, you see Cardinal Richelieu picking off the Huguenot caterpillars off the fleur-de-lis. This is what we're seeing. Basically, he is undermining the power and the independence of the Huguenots that Henry IV had established. And we start to see him get more and more bold doing this, starting in 1627, and eventually culminating in the siege of La Rochelle, which is a major commercial port of the Huguenots, with connections to Holland and England, who are major rivals to France. And this was really an attempt to crush Huguenot power. Eventually, not quite yet, but eventually we are going to see this come to fruition when Louis XIV is going to finally end the Edict of Nantes. And we'll talk about that later this week. And it was Richelieu's idea that the primary foreign policy of France should be to weaken the Habsburgs. And we've talked plenty about that already. This, of course, led to French engagement in the 30 Years' War, and that resulted in even more centralization of the government and of the economy. Because generally we see in times of war, we see increase in government control in order to, to solidify power necessary for military conquest and in order to win a war and, quote unquote, keep the people safe, right? And this was very successful for a time, but this is going to start to create some underlying economic issues in France that are going to be bubbling under the surface of a lot of the absolute monarchy policies that we'll see in France. Because this is going to mean that France has to spend a huge amount of money on their military and their involvement with the 30 Years' War. It's also going to cause increased social tension. Now, we'll talk a bit more about all of that money being spent on things when we get to Louis XIV. But, keep this in mind, these increased social tensions and financial burdens in France, because there's a revolution that we're eventually going to get to that will kind of be the end result of that. Finally, we get to Richelieu's trained successor, Cardinal Jules Mazarin. And he was the chief minister and regent after Louis XIII died, and his son, Louis XIV, was still a child, just like Louis XIII had been. Louis XIV was just a boy, and so he was too young to rule, and when Richelieu died, Mazarin took over, with Anne of Austria as the primary regent during the time. And Mazarin continued Richelieu's centralizing policies, including continuing French participation in the 30 Years' War. But Mazarin was really resented by the French nobility, partially because he was a foreigner, and also because he used his political power to create a huge personal wealth for himself, and that did not look very good. And this is going to lead to an event called the Fronde. And this was a revolt led by the French nobility, who were outraged by taxation and threatened by the rising absolutism of the French monarchy. And we're going to see a divide here between the nobility of France. The nobles of the sword were the old landed nobility who could trace their, noble inheritance back to the Middle Ages. And they were really resentful of these new nobles of the robe, who were the ones who had purchased their titles and government offices from the king, and so they were more loyal to the king. And the nobles of the sword were getting really sick of these new nobles who didn't know how to be nobility and who, were loyal to the king. And they're going to start to make a ruckus. And Cardinal Mazarin is going to start to conflict with the Parlement, which is spelled kind of like parliament. It's Parlements. And these were regional courts and legislatures in France. And they're going to come into conflict about approving new taxes. This, by the way, going back to 3.1, a great example of checks put on absolute power by representative bodies. And the Parlement are going to present a list of demands to Mazarin, including that the Parlement have to approve all new taxes. Now, Mazarin could have said, okay, sure, fine, let's, come up with a compromise. Instead, Mazarin is going to arrest all of the leaders of the Parlement. That is not going to make him any more popular and is going to lead to a series of revolts. Now, interestingly, the Fronde, these revolts, came from all levels of society, not just the nobility. Of course, the nobility wanted more local control and the ability to approve taxes, but the middle and lower classes are actually going to get in on the revolts of the Fronde. And they're going to be protesting all of these constant tax increases that were required to support Mazarin's personal wealth and the French, military involvement in the 30 Years' War and so on. And so the nobility, middle class, and lower class are all going to be teaming up to try and overthrow Mazarin, or at least get their interests taken into consideration. And this got bad enough that the royal family had to flee the royal palace in Paris, and this included a young Louis XIV. Now, Mazarin was finally able to suppress the revolt with force, but he saw the writing on the wall. And so he declared the 14-year-old Louis XIV old enough to rule, specifically so Mazarin could step down and get out of Dodge before he got his head lopped off. And this meant that Louis XIV, now 14 years old, was the sole ruler of France. And all of this factionalism and popular riots that came about from the Fronde left France wishing for peace and wishing for a strong monarchy in order to ensure that peace. And that, plus having to flee Paris because the royal palace was right in the midst of these mobs, all of this is going to leave a big impression on the little Louis XIV. And we're going to see all of these experiences come together to lead to the reign of Louis XIV, which we're going to be talking about for the rest of the week, because Louis XIV is really our key absolute monarch during this time. So, before we move on to talk about Louis XIV later in the week, let's think back to the foundations of absolutism in France. So, how were the foundations of absolutism in France established prior to the reign of Louis XIV? Think about that. Jot down your answers. And that is going to be all for today's lecture. Hopefully, I will be back sooner rather than later so that we can talk about Louis XIV in person. I really, really hope so. But we shall see. I will keep all of you updated. If there's time left in class, which there probably is, go back through your notes, study, and I'd like you to determine the five most important things from both 3.1 and 3.2. In fact, and I know I did not include a table of the five most important things, and I apologize for that. So what I would like you to do is take out a separate sheet of paper, and in the first half of the sheet of paper, I want you to pick out the five most important topics just from 3.1. Then I would like you to do the same thing for 3.2. So you should have 10 by the end, and you should have plenty of time in class. because I don't want you to sacrifice things that you think are important in 3.1 for things you think are important in 3.2, because they are both important. Okay, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope to see you soon, and enjoy the rest of your week. Bye-bye.